Hi, everybody. Thanks for walking through that with us. So I'm Chris, and I'm the founder of Chainflow. And today I've been invited to talk about stake decentralization and why it matters for crypto's future. I should say from the outset, I'm glad to follow up after hearing my friend Gleb. He's always very insightful when it comes to these discussions. So I hope I can do justice by following him. And I'd also like to thank Staking Rewards for providing me with this forum to have this discussion with you, and also each one of you for being here, because this is often a conversation that many choose to avoid for different reasons or not have. And it's actually a conversation that has been turned down by a couple of the bigger conferences lately. So I'm really happy to have a chance to talk about this, what I feel is a really important topic when it comes to staking and the staking economy today. So today we're going to cover a few things. I'll introduce myself and my company Chainflow. We'll get into a discussion about decentralization in terms of what that really means, at least in the context of this presentation. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And then we'll get into some, what I see as some troubling problems related to decentralization that we're seeing in these early days on staking networks. And then finally, we'll talk about why we should care, or hopefully why we should care. And after that, well, I guess not finally, but yeah, and then after that, hopefully we'll move into a more positive part of the conversation where we can talk about what we can do to fix some of these issues and prevent them from taking a hold on these staking networks in a way that will be really hard to reverse in the future. So yeah, first about me. I've spent the early part of my career doing telecom and IT infrastructure work, and what I've been thinking more and more as the bellies of the beasts. So when I say that, I mean government, defense, intelligence, security, and financial institutions, as well as legacy financial institutions like big banks and credit card processors. Fortunately, I was able to leave that world behind quite some time ago. And I got started in crypto back in early 2016, right after Ethereum launched, and came across staking in mid 2016. So I've been involved in one way or another with staking for, I guess, going on about 5 years now. And my concern about decentralization started, I would say, probably during the early days of the Cosmos testnets, going back to, I would say, late 2017 or late 2018. So it's something I've been keeping an eye on for a while, and something that I've been concerned about for quite some time. Now we can talk a little bit about Chainflow. Chainflow is the organization I founded, I guess, going about 4 years ago. And it was really to put my values into action. This is the first time I feel like I've been able to express my values as a human being in the work that I do. I feel pretty grateful for that. So what we're doing is we're trying to build out Web3 infrastructure for a better future. Essentially, that means running validators and other supporting infrastructure for proof of stake networks. I should also say that we're a smaller operator. We have a very small team. I haven't taken any outside investment, and I bootstrapped this and self-funded it from day one, which allows us to operate with a certain degree of independence that I find quite valuable. We're also one of the first entrants to come in from the outside to operate validators on Cosmos, going back about 4 years ago. And today we're supporting about 14 mainnets, including some big names you'll see there. And we continue to come online to more networks as time goes on. All right, so let's get into it here. Let's start with the definition of decentralization. And the reason I feel like this is important is because a lot of us talk about decentralization. However, I'm not sure, we all have the same idea of what decentralization really means. So in this case, for the purposes of our discussion here, when it comes to staking, I'm talking about decentralization as it applies to the number of validators who control either 33% of stake on a network or 51% of stake on a network. And as many of you may know, with 33% of the network, a set of validators can bring that network to a halt. And then furthermore, at 51%, the validators who control 51% of stake on the network can essentially dominate the governance of that network. So we can move on. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so now that we hopefully have a common understanding of what we're talking about when it comes to decentralization, let's talk about the state of stake decentralization and recognize, I feel like, one, I'm a big proponent of proof of stake, and I'm raising these issues as one of caution because I really want to see this industry succeed. However, I have some hesitations about the long-term success of the industry if a number of these issues aren't addressed now. Because I feel like we're in the early days of these networks and we have a chance to prevent them from taking hold in a way that we're not able to reverse. So I really think the time is now for us to start talking about this and to start taking real action to prevent these issues from taking a hold that's just really hard to reverse. So we're going to talk about 3 issues. The first is that stake is rapidly centralizing across networks. We now have a tool such as the Nakamoto coefficient to help us put this number in perspective. And the Nakamoto coefficient, in short, is the number of validators that control 33% of stake on the network. So you'll see on the right side of the slide here that we've started to track this on a weekly basis. And we're also going to be building out a website soon to track it consistently and add more networks too. And there are a couple of things that I wanted to bring to your attention here. The first is that if you look at these numbers, they're quite small. You'll see Polygon, the Nakamoto coefficient is 2. And then you get up to Avalanche and the coefficient rises to 28, which still, especially in the context of proof of work networks, are small numbers. So that's point 1. The second point to draw out here is that you'll see a lot of NCs next to the entries, and that stands for no change. So as we've started to track these numbers, what we've also found is that these numbers don't change much. So they're not increasing much. They're not really decreasing that much either. And what that tells me is that once stake finds a home in these networks, it usually doesn't change that home. So, I mean, there's some exceptions. For example, if a 0 fee validator may change, their fee and increase their fee, you might see some movement. But generally, these numbers are small and they don't change much. Okay, we can move on to the next point here. So what we saw on the previous slide is that, a small number of validators control many of these networks. And not only that, but compounding the problem, a lot of the same validators dominate these multiple networks. So not only do we see validators a small number of validators dominate individual networks, we also are starting to see them dominate multiple networks. You'll see a snapshot here from Cosmos and Solana, and if you look closely, you'll see some overlap among the top, 10 or 20 validators. And again, this isn't to point these networks out specifically, it's only to show an example. But if you look across networks using the block explorers, you'll see this trend across many, many networks. So finally, the last point here that I wanted to talk about is that, on the next slide, please, is that you'll see the governance is really skewed to a select few validators as well. So it probably should come as no surprise. A small number of validators control heavy stakes on many of these networks, and as a result, they tend to have disproportionate control over the governance process of the networks. So you can see here again Cosmos, but this is not specific. This is not unique to Cosmos. If you look at any block explorer, you'll see similar distributions. The distribution falls off really fast as you get down the list, say from 1 to 50 to 100 in this case. And compounding the problem is that some of the largest stakeholders, usually in the form of exchanges, may not even choose to participate in governance. So you have a lot of this stake that's really just sitting there, not actively participating in the governance process. So we can move on, please. All right, so we hear a lot about decentralization, and if we're hearing so much about this, why are we seeing these issues come up? Next slide, please. Well, the easy answer here is Eric B. and Rakim said, everybody's getting paid. I mean, everybody's getting paid out there. Validators are making it pretty comfortable return on the investment of running the validators, delegators are pretty much in the same position, especially in these early days of the networks, where inflation especially can tend to be higher than it may end up in later years in the steady state. So, one pretty obvious reason is, there's a lot of money in these networks right now, and the participants are really getting paid. Okay. So what happens? In a lot of the time, just like in today's economy, getting paid pushes aside other values. So the financial values begin crowding out the other softer, if you will, values that a lot of the crypto first builders who, in my opinion and in my hope, are trying to build out, a better, more fair, equitable, inclusive economy than what we have today. A lot of those issues tend to get pushed aside, unfortunately. And, proof of stake does have a rich get richer problem due to some of the economic choices that have been made in these networks. And then compound that with participants who are really looking simply to maximize their return and not necessarily create value in other ways. This creates basically a problem that feeds upon itself and compounds itself. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from one of the articles that I wrote that I thought sums up, my current feeling pretty well, is that, we really need an appreciation of values in the space other than those in the service of financial gain in order to preserve the core principles of crypto first builders who are truly trying to build out a decentralized future. And it's really my hope that by having conversations like this, we can, increase the volume of those values, at least in a way that helps balance out those finance first values that tend to dominate the industry today. Okay, so that's the doom and gloom part. I'm hoping now, as we move to the next slide, we can talk, about some of the positive things that we can do to fix these problems and also, help them from taking an interminable hold on these networks. So if we're all getting paid, why do we care? Well, we really don't want to repeat this. This is something that came out on CNBC just a couple days ago, and I thought it was pretty relevant to today's conversation. In that, this is a huge conversation. This is a huge concentration of stocks being held by a very small number of wealthy participants. And to me, we really don't want this to happen in the crypto economy that we're building. Next slide, please. And if all we're really looking to do here is rebuild the current economics, the current economy that tends to, be characterized by inequality and inequity and, a lot of other not so great things, then really what's the point of doing this? And if you want to see a little bit more about that, I played that out in what I call a doomsday scenario. And I could send you that link later if you'd like to read it. All right, actually, that was the end of the doom and gloom. So now let's get into what we can do about it. Next slide, please. Okay, well, the first thing we can do first and foremost is we can keep stake decentralized. Stake essentially secures the network, or the delegation of stake secures the network, and the network itself forms the foundation for everything that happens on top of it. So none of these NFTs would be created, none of these DeFi protocols would work if the network wasn't running underneath it. So stake underpins the network underpins everything, all the activity happening on top of it. So first and foremost, what we really need to do is make sure that we keep stake decentralized. Next slide, please. Oh, thanks, you're there. So there are a couple of things we're hearing that make this difficult. And I hear this often from some of the exchanges and some of the larger validator companies, not all of them, but some of them. And I wanted to make that clear. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, we can't control who's staking to us. And that's not, while technically that's true, practically there's some things that validators like us can do in order to continue to attract dominating amounts of stake. The second thing that we hear, and we're starting to hear this one even more often, when asked tough decentralization questions, some of the larger operators will say that we decentralize ourselves. And to me, that doesn't really pass the test of walking the decentralized walk, because saying you don't run all your infrastructure on AWS may help you, but it really doesn't help the network that much. All right, so next slide, please. So here's some things that validators can do. These are practical steps that validators can take to help decentralize stake. So once the validator has a certain amount of stake that's dominating these networks, they can simply turn down the volume on their active marketing to attract more stake. Validators can also actually go so far to discourage additional delegation. For example, if they're in the Nakamoto coefficient, and they can encourage delegation to other validators that they trust. More directly, validators can stake rewards to other validators, both directly and through some stake pools. There are a number of stake pools popping up on Solana to make it really easy to delegate stake in a decentralized way. And finally, the large validators can help smaller independent validators break into the active set. And then for delegators, delegators can really help out here too. I would suggest first, define your values. Think about why you're in this space and what it means to you and why you're here. Then after that, do some research and choose validators whose values align with your own. Staking rewards is a great site to start to get to know some of the validators and get to know the operators behind the machines, and choose some validators whose values align with those that you've defined for yourself. You can also delegate to multiple validators. And again, the algorithmic stake pools, hopefully they'll start emerging on some networks other than Solana. This also helps distribute your risk because you don't have all of your tokens in one basket. And then finally, hold networks and validators like us accountable and speak up. If you see something that is pushing things in an unhealthy way toward more centralization, speak up and make your voice heard and help push back against some of these other forces that I've talked about earlier. All right, and I thought Inspector Deck summed it up pretty nicely here. Don't talk the talk if you can't walk the walk. I mean, I think figure out your values, and those of us who are here to really hopefully build out a true decentralized future, walking that walk comes naturally. But I think if we're in this for financial gain, that's fine too. But things get really confusing when people are saying they support decentralization but taking actions that really are supporting centralization. So if you don't talk the talk, or don't talk the talk if you can't walk the walk. And with that, I thank you. And if you'd like to talk more about decentralization and don't really feel like there's a safe space to do so, please come to the Chainflow Telegram group. We're really happy to talk about this and really want to talk about it more. And you can follow us on Twitter too to receive those Nakamoto coefficient updates every week. And with that, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that there, Chris, and definitely more grounded presentation than we've experienced before in the past. So it is really cool to hear all the values that you're presenting there in terms of decentralization. And just to start you off with a quick question here. So you mentioned that large exchanges, most of them are not actively participating in governance. How do you suggest that we incentivize them to participate and to have more appreciation for decentralized values?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess one of the things I'm learning, or one of the things that I've observed, is that you have to balance out incentivizing good behavior and disincentivizing unwanted behaviors. So I really think what I'm coming around to is we have to do things like tie, I don't know about slashing, but some penalty to certain actions that if they don't happen, people essentially get a light punishment. So if people aren't voting, I think in a way there should be some type of either incentivization to reward those who are participating, or some adverse action to essentially punish people who aren't participating. So I think that applies to the governance question. The second one is hard because a lot of these big companies have investors, and they're playing out the usual Silicon Valley high growth VC model, which is chasing as much growth as possible. And unfortunately, chasing a high growth model with no upper bounds is really orthogonal to some of the core principles of decentralization. So I really think it has to come from an internal values decision by the operator, and then also accountability by those who choose to stake to them, holding them accountable to do more than simply, maximize return.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks again for the talk. I think it's amazing to have someone like you who fosters decentralization a lot, especially educating protocols on it and educating users on it. I think it's extremely valuable. And I even think decentralization is so important for the success of a network, as like building a credible neutral framework that developers and businesses can be built upon. And like currently I see Ethereum is like probably the most decentralized in terms of their economics and also in terms of the ecosystem and everything. Do you, like, to your experience, like working with over 14 networks, validating on them, what's the network or the team, the ecosystem that cares the most about decentralization and in terms of like the economics and the education around it and so on?
Yeah, good questions. So 3 come to mind. So I think Cosmos is probably one of the most decentralized networks in terms of development right now. The stake is somewhat heavy on the top 6 and it's not moving around much. But I do feel like Cosmos is built inherently on some pretty strong decentralized values. And I hope over time that those values continue to percolate into some of these newer entrants who are, coming in with pretty heavy bags to validate or to delegate places. Contrary to what a lot of people think, I think Solana is really committed to decentralization too. I've known that team for quite some time and had some really good conversations with them about, their efforts to decentralize. And I think they're taking some real steps toward decentralizing their network. I mean, they have over 1,000 validators. Of course, the Nakamoto coefficient's around 20, but I really see them taking some efforts like supporting stake pools, making it easier to get hardware, doing the stake-o-matic thing that I think really points to a commitment to decentralization. And then also Scale. Scale is out there, and I've been talking quite a bit with Jack, the founder of Scale, and he really seems to be committed to decentralization. What happens, what a lot of the networks struggle with is, they need to launch with some degree of centralization. And what they struggle with is then, being able to decentralize out from there. So it's a balance that a lot of people play. But I think the networks that I find support decentralization well are aware of that tension, and being aware of that tension, is the first step to actually taking steps to decentralize, as opposed to getting addicted to centralization and then, that's it.
Really cool. Yeah. And I think we can just take on like one community question here before we move on to Bernd from Avado, who are actually doing like the Avado, like to run nodes from home, which also supports this centralization in such a great and idealistic way. So like, do you think liquid staking or like liquid staking solutions overall will help with decentralization or like can help for decentralization, and to what extent, and how will that play out in a sense?
I think liquid staking, assuming that they're tied to a stake pool, can help. I think the key differentiator is how the validators that the stake pool delegates to are chosen. So if it's a closed set of validators chosen through an opaque process, and if that closed set of validators already includes some of the largest validators on the network, I think that is a recipe to continue centralizing stake. However, if those validators are chosen, algorithmically, for example, in a very open way, and prevent stake accumulating to some of the top holders who already have great degrees of stake, I think those types of liquid staking or stake pools can contribute to the decentralization of the network. So I really think it all depends on how the validators that are receiving the delegation from those pools are chosen.
Excellent. And again, thank you for joining us here today. Chris Remus from Chainflow, everyone. Put your hands together. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks again for having me.